Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for Alphascape V1.0 Savage, also known as O9S. This is the first Savage raid made available by patch 4.4 in Final Fantasy XIV Prelude in Violet. The requests for this video have been coming in like a tsunami, with raiders earthquaking in their boots at the accreting number of mechanics. In order to make head or tailwinds of the chaotic nature of this encounter, I'm going to break down each phase to its basic element. My name is Tech and I'll be your raid guide. This encounter can follow one of two possible mechanic paths, determined by the first major attack Chaos uses at the very beginning of the fight. Damning Edict is a massive 180-degree frontal attack. All players will need to move directly behind him to avoid it. This attack will also tell you that the first two phases will be Blaze and Cyclone. Longitudinal Implosion is an alternating AoE attack that will throw out two large AoE cones in front and behind the boss first, followed immediately by two large AoE cones on his sides. If the boss uses Latitudinal Implosion instead, the AoE attack first targets his sides before immediately targeting the front and the back. Players will need to identify the positioning of the attack based on the name of the cast and position themselves appropriately. Getting hit by one of these attacks will deal damage and place a magic vulnerability up debuff on you. Getting hit by both of these attacks will kill you. If the boss begins with this attack, you'll know that the first two phases will be Tsunami and Earthquake. These phases will always occur in their specific pairs. You'll go through the first phase pair, then deal with the Bowels of Agony Dark Crystal transitional phase, and then deal with the second phase pair before beginning the Enrage phase. In this guide, we'll go through the four phases first. If the boss casts Damning Edict at the beginning of the encounter, you'll know to expect the Blaze phase first. The phase begins with the formation of a small safe area in the center of the platform. Standing in the fire will place a fire debuff on you and deal damage. The boss will also cast Blaze, which will do high raid-wide damage to all players and afflict them with the Entropy debuff. Tanks and healers will have about a 10-second duration of this debuff, while the damage dealers will have a 24-second duration. When the duration of the debuff expires, the affected players will be hit with AoE circles that deal high damage and knock back anyone around them. To avoid this, we assign positions for each player to facilitate spreading these out. Unaffected players will stand inside the safety of the boss's hitbox. Immediately after, the boss will cast Longitudinal or Latitudinal Implosion. All players will need to position themselves appropriately to avoid both parts of the attack. Around this time, the damage dealer entropy debuffs will be expiring. After dodging the second half of the implosion attack, the damage dealers will move to their assigned positions on the outside, while the tanks and healers huddle inside of the hitbox. Immediately after, the boss will cast Chaotic Dispersion. This is a heavy-hitting physical tank buster that will also place a physical vulnerability up debuff on the affected tank. Cooldown and heal through this attack and tank swap during the cast to avoid death. Next up, Chaos will cast Blaze again, dealing high raid damage and reapplying the same entropy debuffs on everyone. The healers and tanks will quickly spread to their assigned spots, while the damage dealers stay in the middle. Next, Knockdown will mark up each tank and healer with a stack up marker, and each damage dealer will have to move into their assigned spots as well to stack with their tank or healer buddy, sharing that damage appropriately. This attack will also place a magic vulnerability up debuff on the players, so make sure there's no overlap between the four player groups. This is around the time that the damage dealer entropy debuffs are expiring, so tanks and healers will collapse back into the center after sharing that damage to avoid getting hit and knocked back by entropy. The damage dealers will stand in their assigned spots until that entropy debuff resolves. Next, Big Bang will destroy anyone standing in the location of the shared knockdown attacks, so all players must quickly move into the center of the platform to avoid that damage. This attack is followed by 4 Fiendish orbs that spawn in a square formation and begin throwing out 4 sets of long column AoE attacks. Players will have to quickly dodge these attacks as necessary. Once these orbs finish their attack, the platform will return to normal and the Blaze phase is complete. Blaze will always be followed by a Cyclone phase. In this phase, the center of the platform will be covered by a large tornado that should be avoided. The main tank can drag the boss out of the center as soon as Blaze phase concludes to allow players to avoid the Cyclone and still maintain uptime. The boss will cast Cyclone, dealing high raid-wide damage and placing a headwind debuff on each tank and healer, and a tailwind debuff on each damage dealer. At the end of the duration, players will be dealt high damage, knocked up, and debuffed, unless it is appropriately removed by a proper knockback. Furthermore, the head and tailwind debuffs affect the distance players are knocked back by specific mechanics based on which direction they're facing. This will come into play soon. The boss will cast Umbra Smash, and a corner of the platform will be marked for proximity-based damage. As the cast completes, he will jump into that corner and begin to cast Damning Edict into the center of the platform. At the same time, the tornado in the center will begin to throw out telegraphs indicating an unavoidable knockback is incoming. To handle this combo, players will need to use the knockback from the tornado to be pushed safely behind Chaos to avoid the Damning Edict attack. The trick comes in appropriately facing your character to avoid getting knocked off the platform by your debuff. Tanks and healers with Headwind want to have their backs to the tornado. Damage dealers with Tailwind want to be facing the tornado. All players can position themselves in the same spot right by the tornado. Just make sure your character is facing the appropriate direction, or you will be pushed too far and flung off the platform. If done correctly, this knockback will cleanse your head or Tailwind debuff. After the knockback, make sure you stay behind the boss until the Damning Edict cast goes off. Next up, another chaotic dispersion tank buster on the main tank. Don't forget your cooldowns and your tank swap. Immediately after, the boss will cast another Cyclone, dealing more raid-wide damage and reapplying the same head and tailwind debuffs to all players. The next knockdown attack is a bit different. This time, both healers will have the getaway markers and they'll have to run away from the rest of the raid. At the same time, the tornado in the center is signaling the next knockback is about to happen. To handle this combo, we assign the adjacent corners to each healer, ensuring they are far enough away to avoid excess damage. The tanks and damage dealers will position themselves next to the tornado in the same manner as before to be appropriately knocked back into the same corner. The healers will position themselves next to the tornado in their own respective corner and be knocked into those corners instead. Immediately after the knockback and knockdown damage resolves, Chaos will cast Big Bang again. This attack will target the location of the knockdown damage on each healer, so they need to immediately return to the group after the knockback to avoid death. Next up, 2 Fiendish orbs will spawn in the adjacent corners and tether to 2 random players. These orb tethers can and must be intercepted by the tanks as they will do high damage at the end of the cast. Tanks will need to use appropriate cooldowns to survive this damage. After the orbs, the Cyclone will disappear, marking the end of the phase, and Chaos will return to the center. At this point in the true fight, you would be moving on to the Bowels of Agony Dark Crystal Transitional Orb phase, but for the purpose of this guide, we're going to look at the second phase set first. Going all the way back to the beginning. If that first attack is a lat or longitudinal attack, you'll know to expect the Tsunami phase first. The Tsunami phase begins with the east and west sides of the platform filling with water, leaving only a thin column in the center as a safe area. The boss will also cast Tsunami, dealing high raid-wide damage and applying a dynamic fluid debuff on all players. This debuff will last 10 seconds on the tanks and the healers, and 17 seconds on the damage dealers. At the end of its duration, this debuff will explode a large AoE water donut around the affected player. Getting hit by this water donut AoE will kill you, so your positioning during this time is very important. Next up, the boss will cast Umbra Smash and jump to one side of the safe part of the platform, dealing proximity-based damage. To avoid excess damage, players will need to move away from this side. In our group, we keep the boss in the center and then adjust based on what side he jumps towards. You can also pull him to one side first, forcing him to jump to the same side every time. However, we found that this strategy involved too much running across the platform and we're lazy. The tank and healer dynamic fluid debuffs will expire at the same time as the boss jumps away, so all players will need to be stacked together at a safe distance to avoid death from the incoming water donut AoE attacks and the proximity damage. The boss will immediately cast Damning Edict, and all players will need to quickly make their way behind the boss to avoid it. Right before Damning Edict goes off, the damage dealer dynamic water debuffs will expire, so everyone behind Chaos must ensure they're stacked appropriately to avoid accidentally killing anyone with the water donut AoEs. At this point, we reposition Chaos in the middle again. Next, he'll cast Chaotic Dispersion on the main tank. Make sure you cooldown and tank swap appropriately. Next, another Tsunami cast, dealing heavy raid-wide damage and reapplying dynamic fluid debuffs on all players. Immediately after, both healers will be marked with the getaway markers. One healer will run to the north side of the platform, and the other will run to the south side, while the rest of the raid stacks together in the exact center. The tank and healer dynamic fluid debuffs will resolve at the same time as knockdown goes off, and this positioning allows for everyone to survive. Next up, Big Bang will destroy anything in the location where the knockdown markers were taken, so both healers need to immediately return to the center to avoid death. They'll need to quickly stack up with the rest of the raid since the damage dealer debuffs are going to expire at the same time. Once that combo of mechanics resolves, 2 fiendish orbs will spawn in the Big Bang locations and will need to be intercepted by each tank. The raid can continue to stand in the center under the boss, while each tank stands at max melee to easily intercept the tethers. Make sure you cool down through that orb damage as necessary. Once the orbs attack, the platform will return to normal and the tsunami phase completes. The main tank can reposition the boss at this time on the north edge of the platform in preparation for the next phase. The earthquake phase will always follow the tsunami phase, which, if you really think about it, is true chaos. In this phase, the entire south side of the platform will be inaccessible and the boss will cast Earthquake, dealing high raid-wide damage and placing 20-second debuffs on all players. The tanks and healers will be affected by accretion, while the damage dealers will deal with primordial crust. If these debuffs are not removed appropriately by the end of their duration, the affected players will die. Tanks and healers will need to be fully healed to remove their debuffs. Damage dealers need to take lethal damage to remove their debuff. After these debuffs are applied, you'll notice a large telegraph signaling an incoming knockback from the north. Immediately after, the boss will cast a lat longitudinal implosion combo. Let's break this down slowly. All players will get their debuffs. Healers will be topping off everyone after the earthquake here, so the tank and healer debuffs will resolve pretty easily. Every player will stack in front of the boss as the knockback is happening to keep them close to the boss after the knockback, allowing them to quickly adjust their positioning for the incoming lat longitudinal implosions. Tanks and healers will dodge the implosions in the same manner, making sure to avoid each hit. Damage dealers will want to get hit by both implosions on purpose to ensure that they take lethal damage. Doing so will resolve their debuff. Next, another chaotic dispersion tank buster. Don't forget your cooldowns and tank swap appropriately. This is followed by yet another earthquake cast. Be ready for the high raid damage and get ready to handle the next set of debuffs. Again, the tank and healer debuffs will be resolved fairly easily through natural raid healing, but don't forget to keep an eye out on those HP bars just in case. Another knockback from the north is next, but this time it's followed by 4 sets of stack up markers on the tanks and healers. To handle this, we have assigned positions along the north edge of the platform for each player pair. This ensures that they'll be knocked back together to share the damage properly and without overlap on any other pair. After the knockback and share damage, the tanks and healers can return to the north side of the platform, while the damage dealers hang out a bit. The stack up damage isn't enough to deal lethal damage, but the incoming Big Bang attack sure is. The damage dealers will stay on the south side of the platform to take the Big Bang hits that will occur in the same area the knockdown damage was shared. This will deal them lethal damage, resolving their debuff appropriately. Next, 4 fiendish orbs will spawn in the corners and throw out another 4 rounds of AoE attacks. Dodge these as necessary. Once the orbs disappear, the earthquake phase ends and the boss returns to the center. As mentioned earlier, the encounter will always start with 1 set of elemental phases based on that first attack. Once that first set completes, the boss will return to the center and cast Bowels of Agony. This cast brings all player health pools to 1, marks up the tanks and healers with dynamic fluid and headwind, and marks up the damage dealers with entropy and primordial crust. Chaos will then disappear and a dark crystal will spawn that he will draw dark aether from. If the crystal is not destroyed before he reaches 100 on his gauge, you will wipe. With all these debuffs and a DPS check at the same time, it can be a little confusing, so let's break it down. Each damage dealer needs to die. The only lethal damage available comes from the dynamic fluid debuffs on the tanks and healers. However, the tanks and healers have headwind, so they need to be appropriately knocked back to resolve their cooldown before they can use dynamic fluid to kill their DPS buddies. Since there's no tornado, the knockback they're looking for comes from the entropy debuffs on each damage dealer. With the timing of each debuff, the way this works out is fairly simple. We have the damage dealers at set locations around the orb so that they can freely damage the crystal the entire time. The tanks and healers will pair up with their damage dealers and then position themselves facing away from their partner. This can be done in a variety of different ways, so use whatever method you find works best for your group. The entropy debuff will resolve first, and the damage will knock back the tanks and the healers, which in turn will resolve their headwind debuffs. Once they are able to move, the tanks and healers will position themselves in such a way that their water donuts hit their DPS partners, being careful to ensure no overlap on the others. If done correctly, all debuffs will be resolved at this time, and you can continue to destroy the orb uninterrupted. Once the orb is down, Soul of Chaos will deal raid-wide damage. Shield and heal through this as necessary. Once Chaos returns, the other of the 2 pairs pairs of elemental phases will occur next. Remember, if you started with Blaze and Cyclone, after the transitional phase you'll deal with Tsunami and Earthquake. If you started with Tsunami, you'll start with Blaze after that transition. Each mini elemental phase is the same regardless of the order it happens in, so it's just a matter of going through the motions. Once all 4 elemental phases are complete, Chaos will return to the center and begin his Soft Enrage phase. You can survive for quite a bit of time through this phase before the final Hard Enrage, so don't despair if you haven't killed him at this point. He starts off by casting Blaze. This obviously does massive raid-wide damage, but it will also put up a 6-second entropy debuff on all players. Since they all resolve at the same time, each player must spread apart to avoid overlap. Next, he'll cast Tsunami. More raid-wide damage, and everyone is afflicted by Dynamic Fluid. All players will need to stack together underneath him to avoid clipping each other with their water donuts. At this point, the Enrage phase becomes way more difficult to handle since you have no way to resolve the incoming debuffs. He'll cast Cyclone and then Earthquake before one final Bowels of Agony that will destroy any remaining players. If you can get through each phase with minimal deaths, you'll have no problem reaching the DPS check. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Up next, we'll head into Alphascape version 2.0 Savage. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.